This video is about and contains spoilers for the video game Wednesdays. Wednesdays is about an adult who, as a child, was sexually abused by a family member. It does not depict or simulate the abuse, but does talk frankly about its emotional and psychological impact, and obviously, so will this video. While we're talking about content warnings, this game has some of the best I've ever seen. There's top level CW for the whole game, but each scene has its own general warnings and a detailed version with spoilers. Any of these scenes can be skipped at any time, and that does not affect your completion of the game. I'm not someone who really personally gets much from content warnings, but I have friends who do, and I think this is a really responsible, thoughtful approach given the subject matter, which is treated seriously and directly, but is not a grim or depressing game. There are definitely points where it made me cry, but is often quite funny and hopeful. It's about someone healing and moving forward. That someone is Timothy. As Timothy, you boot up an old video game and amusement park sim, and each time you build a ride, it unlocks a memory. These scenes play like a visual novel. There are some limited points of interactivity, dialogue choices, but they don't change the arc or the end of the scene. Something that's really interesting here is that you're not choosing what Timothy says, you're choosing what his friends and family members say to him. The main character is deprived of that agency, and he's presented with this faceless, expressionless cubicle head in a way that kind of others him. He feels depersonalized, awkward, hard to interact with. We are subtly alienated from Timothy within his own memories. It evokes being alienated from yourself. The game does a number of clever things within this general framework. There's a scene where Tim and his dad are standing outside a church at his grandmother's funeral, and Dad is trying to connect to him. He's having difficulty drawing him into conversation. Suddenly, Tim starts to cry, and Dad can either give him a hug or wait. And I choose hug, and Dad hesitates. It comes up again. Give him a hug now, or wait for the right time. I choose now, and Dad stands there watching, paralyzed. Now he compromises with himself, makes himself a promise. I will count to 3, and then I will hug him. But before Dad gets there, someone else hugs Tim. And this is his cousin Giovanni. This is his abuser. As a kid, Timothy spent his Wednesdays at his grandparents' house. Giovanni's family lived next door, and he'd go over where he would be abused. He would go over knowing he would be abused. He went as often as he could. And it's a very difficult feeling for adults dealing with this kind of childhood trauma. The idea that maybe you must have wanted it, that it's your fault. And the game strikes a really good balance with evoking and exploring these feelings while being very clear that none of this is Tim's fault. He was a victim. Victim is the word the game uses rather than survivor. And these are two words with very different connotations, and there's sometimes a lot of discourse around that. In interviews and on the game's Steam page, its writer-director Pierre Corbinat consistently uses the word victim, both to describe Timothy and himself. The game is drawing from his own experiences. So I'm going to use the word victim here, both to respect that, and because it centers Timothy's lack of agency. About halfway through the game, Tim is on a car trip with a friend, Urim, and the mood is very tense. Urim has something he needs to tell Tim. All your options are to broach the subject with the words, something happened. But when you click on one of those bubbles, it's replaced with something else, with anything else. He wants to tell Tim, needs to tell him. But like Tim's dad in the hug, he can't bring himself to do it. Until, finally, he does. His uncle was a pedophile, and has killed himself in jail. And Timothy, awkwardly, clumsily, starts with a complicated degree of empathy for the uncle, something that's not uncommon for victims to do. And Urim just does not understand where Tim is coming from at all. And then the game does something really beautiful. For the first time, it gives you dialogue choices for Tim. You tell Urim what happened to you. You tell someone else for the first time. And it's really empowering, really moving, especially coming fairly deep into the game. With visual novels, people sometimes ask, why does this have to be a game? Why isn't it a book or a movie? And I think that's kind of a bullshit question in most cases because interactivity, even limited interactivity, does change how you engage with a thing, does change the emotional resonance. But I think that question would be especially misplaced here because this moment where Tim takes agency, it only works because up until this point, even in his own memories, he is not making choices. Even playing this old video game, Orko Park, your choices are so limited and inconsequential. There's no strategy here, it's only a framing device. And when the game lets you build decorations to increase park happiness, that activity feels empty, deliberately empty. You can also pick up trash around the park to earn extra money, but you're never really short of money. And when that was introduced, it felt rhetorically meaningless, and I was eager to just build the next ride, get to the next memory. Shortly after telling Urim, there's a scene where Timothy calls a cousin, the younger brother of his abuser, and tells him what happened to him. And the game takes a really bold swing, frequently interrupting the call with a chorus of victims sharing their experiences. Sometimes they overlap with Tim's, sometimes they're starkly different. Something the game is really good about is saying, this is Timothy's experience, but it's not universal. The content warnings will frequently refer to this. For example, Tim's family and friends all believe and support him. And that's not your experience. This scene might be hard for you. This phone call scene, all these people who have been hurt, all their complicated, messy feelings, it just absolutely wrecked me. I haven't cried like that in a long time. And when I returned to the park, I couldn't build the next ride. I couldn't just go to the next scene. So I tidied up the park, picked up the garbage, straightened the treasure chests. When you click on this little crab, he hides in the sand. When you try to clean up a sandcastle, it makes a sad little noise. Well, I don't want that, so at this point, I start cleaning up between each scene, but I leave the sandcastles. And soon there's a lot of them. The park lets me take a breath, lets me process. And that's because it doesn't require me to think or really make decisions. It's just keeping my brain a little busy so it can calm down. And in this way, it's not just a framing device, but a fundamental part of the design, a necessary element. In the back half of the game, as Tim is talking more openly about his experiences, you're coming into contact with other victims. Something the game tries to hammer home is that it's a lot more common than you would think. And this is a way the game includes experiences and points of view beyond Tim's. There's a sequence with his friend Maxime, who was abused by his brother. His parents are supportive, but also defend and support their other son, his abuser. Over the course of the sequence, you're not choosing Maxime's dialogue, but what he's painting. Not what he says, but how he feels. It's a chance for the player to be really expressive, to explore their own feelings. It's really cathartic. As the people in Tim's life find out what happened to him, they react in some pretty different ways. At one point, the big whale from the video game finds out, and he's been chill and calming this whole time. But now he's like, I'm going to find that guy, and I'm going to kick his ass. And that was really funny. It's not how you would want someone to react. It's not helpful. It makes it more about them. But it was funny. And then the next time I came back to the park, he apologized for that and said, hey, that probably wasn't helpful. He just feels responsible because he feels like he let us down by not noticing. This is a frequent theme of the game, something Tim struggles with. Why didn't any of the adults notice? Why didn't anyone help him? He felt so alone and isolated. During the sequence with Maxime, Tim expresses guilt because he kinda knew what Maxime's brother was doing, but didn't do anything about it. And his friend points out, you had your own stuff going on, and you were a child. None of this was your fault. Not what happened to you and not what happened to me. At the end of the game, having gotten support from his friends and his family, Tim confronts Giovanni. And Giovanni acknowledges what he did, acknowledges it was wrong, accepts responsibility, apologizes, does not make excuses. Importantly, in this scene, you are in complete control of Timothy. He is the one with agency. Just as important, these choices aren't about dialogue and texture, it's about how the story ends. Giovanni says if we want to start legal proceedings, want to put him in jail, he will cooperate. And we decide if we want that. We decide what we want from him. For him to tell people what he did, or to apologize to our parents, or he just doesn't get to be part of our life anymore. I chose the last one. And then I chose to forgive him. Not for his sake, but for mine. For closure. Different people playing the game, of course, will choose differently. Some of those people will themselves be victims. And for some of those people, the idea of confronting your abuser, of having them admit what they did and explain why they did it without excusing it, the idea of then forgiving them and moving on, will be incredibly cathartic. For others, the whole thing will feel like an absurd fantasy. Because you know that abuser will never admit it, never say that it wasn't your fault. For me, it's both these things at once. I don't like the word victim myself, but I don't like survivor either, because I don't feel like I survived it. It's been decades, but it still feels present and overwhelming. It's impacted my ability to function in the world, my relationship with my own body, my relationships with friends, partners, family. I don't actually understand how families work at all. People explain it to me, but it feels abstract. I don't really have a point of reference. I'm pretty open with my life and my experiences, but I haven't talked about this. Part of that is shame, which I'm still working on. Part of it is when you tell people what happened, sometimes they look at you different, like you're tainted in some way, damaged beyond repair. And that's less about how it makes you feel and more that you're worried you're making them uncomfortable just by existing, and you don't want to do that to people. So you make yourself as small and as isolated and as hidden as possible. Part of it is I'm a trans woman, and it doesn't feel responsible. You know, people think, well, that's why you're trans. Something happened to you. Trans people are statistically more likely to have this happen to them than cis people. But I'm not trans because I was abused. I was abused because I'm trans. Because that made me vulnerable. Because even if they didn't have the words for what I was, they could tell. And they knew that meant no one would help me. And no one did. This is the part of the video where I point you to RAIN and their resources for survivors. But if you're trans, they've removed all their pages for trans people and all the stories of trans people to avoid angering the current administration. For a long time, I felt so alone. And a little less than 2 years ago, I finally told someone. And since then, I've met others, told others, and I don't feel quite so alone anymore. And I've played this game, and it reminded me how important it is to know that you're not alone. And if you're watching this, you're not alone. And it's possible for you to heal and to have joy. I am healing. I do have joy. I'm I'm quite accomplished actually. I wrote a book last year. I've designed dozens of games. I was profiled in New Yorker. I'm pretty rad. I have a lot of love in my life. I'm good at that actually. I'm good at loving and being loved. And I figure if knowing all that can help someone, the least I can do is talk about it. Thank you to my Patreon supporters who probably weren't expecting this as a follow up to my last video. I wasn't expecting it either. Next one is about the history of word games that use dice, so probably not as heavy. Thank you for watching.